At a private home in Ikeja, Lagos, on a Sunday in October 1986, a sealed envelope was handed to a journalist. Minutes later, Nigeria had its most infamous press assassination. His name was Dele Giwa. He was 39, co-founder and editor-in-chief of Newswatch magazine. On Sunday, October 19, 1986, a package reached his residence in Ikeja. He was not alone. A colleague, also a journalist, was with him inside the house. And here's the first detail that still hangs in the air almost 4 decades later. The envelope looked official enough that the first instinct in the room was that it might be from the highest office in the country. But official or not, when the package was opened, it exploded. If this was a targeted assassination, then who could deliver a lethal device into a private home in broad daylight and vanish? And why him on that day? To understand why this case mattered, you have to understand the moment Nigeria was living in. The mid-1980s were the military era. Government power was centralized. The security services were feared. And journalism, especially investigative journalism, carried risk. Newswatch was one of the publications that pushed into that risk zone. Dele Giwa became known for reporting that irritated powerful people and for writing with a sharpness that didn't flatter authority. Now, here's what is not disputed in the record. Before his death, Giwa had been having interactions with state security and military intelligence officials. According to the Oputa Panel report, those discussions involved accusations from security officials that he was a security risk, including allegations tied to arms-related claims and destabilizing the government. And the timeline tightens further. Sources summarized by ECOI, referencing international coverage, note that 2 days before his death, Giwa had been summoned to the headquarters of the State Security Service. The Oputa Panel also records that before the murder, he had been in contact with Colonel Hakeem Akilu, then associated with military intelligence, and Colonel A.K. Togun, then a senior figure in state security. If a journalist tells you he's being pressured by powerful security officials, and then he's killed by a device delivered to his home, you don't need drama. The facts already create the question. Now we go to Sunday. A key witness account comes from the colleague who was with Giwa that morning, journalist Kayode Soyinka, who later wrote publicly about the event and disputed claims made about his own role. In that account, a package arrived at the gate. It was passed inward, and it was eventually delivered to Giwa by his teenage son. The Oputa Panel report confirms the core point. Giwa was murdered in his home by a letter bomb on Sunday, October 19, 1986, by persons unknown. Different public retellings vary on small details, like whether the moment is best described as breakfast or in his study. What does not vary is the sequence. The envelope arrived, was handed to him, and the device detonated when it was opened. Another detail appears repeatedly across reporting and recollections. The immediate thought that the envelope looked like something official, leading to the remark, remembered by a colleague, that it must be from the president. And then the explosion happened. I'm going to be very careful here. We don't need graphic description. The record is clear on the outcome. Giwa was fatally injured. He was rushed for help, and he died the same day. Who had the capability to construct such a device, disguise it as official, and get it delivered cleanly into a residential compound? What happens next in cases like this usually decides whether justice is possible. An early crime scene is fragile. Evidence can be preserved or lost. Witnesses can be protected or intimidated. Leads can be pursued or quietly buried. In this case, the Oputa Panel report later describes the murder as insidiously novel and says it ought to be thoroughly investigated in the interest of justice, public safety, and rule of law. That phrasing matters because it hints at something important. Nigeria did not just lose a journalist. Nigeria entered a new kind of political violence. The who was not settled at the scene. No one was arrested immediately as the identified sender, and the case quickly became more than a homicide investigation. It became a national question about power. Here's where the documentary becomes uncomfortable. Not because we know too much, but because we know enough to see where the road should have gone and where it didn't. The Oputa Panel report records that police investigation was carried out through the Force Criminal Investigation Department in Lagos, and it names Abubakar B. Tsav as a key investigator who submitted an interim report. According to that report, Tsav recommended that Colonel Hakeem Akilu and Colonel A.K. Togun be made available for investigation and voice identification. Then comes a critical finding. The Oputa Panel report states that these two security figures were never investigated by the police, and that the interim report was suppressed. Read that again, slowly. An official inquiry later says, there was an interim investigative report. It pointed toward further steps involving senior security figures. Those steps were not taken, and the report was suppressed. If you're building a true crime channel rooted in facts, this is exactly the kind of detail you highlight, because it is documented, not imagined. The question isn't only who did it, it becomes, why did the investigation fail to follow its own recommendations? In 2001, Nigeria's Human Rights Commission process, often called the Oputa Panel, tried to summon former leaders and officials connected to major national controversies, including Giwa's murder. Reporting at the time noted that suspicion continued to trail the highest levels of power, and that legal efforts to force testimony faced resistance. So the case didn't just go cold, it became politically radioactive. By the early 2000s, the story wasn't just about 1986 anymore. It was about what Nigeria could and could not investigate about itself. The Oputa Panel report captures a broad conclusion. No one was ever arraigned or prosecuted for the murder. It also records that the petitioner, Gani Fawahinmi, faced harassment and prosecution for pushing the matter. And the panel's recommendation was blunt. Reopen the investigation. Build a team that includes senior police leadership and representatives from relevant institutions, with observers from journalism and human rights groups. That's not the language of a panel that believes everything was handled properly. It's the language of a panel saying, this was mishandled, and it is dangerous to leave it that way. If an official body says, reopen and prosecute suspects, why does the country still have no closure? So where does that leave us, strictly on the record? It leaves us with these fixed points. Dele Giwa, editor-in-chief of Newswatch, was killed in Ikeja, Lagos, on Sunday, October 19, 1986, by a letter bomb. Before his death, he had interactions with state security and military intelligence figures, and he had been summoned by the State Security Service shortly before the assassination. A later national inquiry reviewed evidence and stated that an interim police report existed, recommended further steps involving senior security figures, and that those steps were not taken, and the report was suppressed. No one was ultimately prosecuted for his murder. And that is where the documented record lands, a murder that shaped Nigerian journalism, and an investigation that never produced courtroom accountability. Sources used for this video: Oputa Panel Report, HRVIC, archived reporting and witness accounts on record.